My sister attacked me because I refused to give her my car. My parents took her side. My name is Alice, I'm 24, and this year was supposed to be the start of everything I've worked so hard for. After years of grinding through university while juggling part-time jobs, I finally landed a programming job that pays well enough to give me some sense of stability. To celebrate, I bought myself a car, a modest Ford that I've nicknamed Independence. It's not flashy, but to me, it's everything. It's my freedom, my hard work materialized. I live at home with my parents and my older sister, Emma, who's 27. It's not ideal, but rent prices are insane, and this setup lets me save for the future. That being said, it's not without its challenges. Emma has always been the golden child in our family. Growing up, she got the best of everything, while I've always had to prove myself. If Emma wanted something, it was handed to her. If I wanted something, I had to earn it. For the most part, I've made peace with it. But this time, Emma has crossed a line. The day I brought my car home, Emma seemed unimpressed. I expected her usual indifference. She's never cared about my achievements. But what I didn't expect was her casually suggesting that I should give her the car because, in her words, she deserves it more.
Why?
Because she got her driver's license before I did. She has a way of saying the most absurd things like they're perfectly reasonable. At first, I thought it was a joke. But when she brought it up again over dinner, I realized she was serious. She claimed it would only be fair since she's been waiting longer for a car. Never mind that she doesn't have a job and rarely even leaves the house. The kicker? My parents backed her up. They didn't outright demand I hand over the car, but they didn't shut her down either. Instead, they suggested I think about it for the sake of keeping peace in the family. This isn't new behavior for Emma. She's always had a way of making everything about her. Growing up, she was the star of every family gathering, the one whose achievements were celebrated while mine were politely overlooked. If she wanted the last piece of cake, she'd get it. If she wanted to skip chores, I'd be the one stuck with her share. My parents brushed it off as sibling dynamics, but it's clear who's always had the upper hand. When I refused to entertain Emma's demand, she escalated. She stormed into the living room the next evening and declared that I was being selfish and inconsiderate. She called me ungrateful, said I was only where I was because our parents supported me through college, as if that wasn't the bare minimum they'd also done for her. She started crying, saying she'd always been there for me, and this was how I repaid her. The dramatics were exhausting. My parents, predictably, came to her defense. They said it wouldn't hurt me to let her use the car for a while, since I work from home most days. They kept talking about how much stress it would alleviate for Emma, how it would bring the family closer together if I made this sacrifice. It wasn't even about the car anymore. It was about family dynamics, about my role as the younger sibling who's supposed to understand. I'm not one to shy away from confrontation, but this situation feels different. It's not just about standing up for myself. It's about years of being overlooked, of being expected to bend while Emma gets her way. Handing over the car wouldn't just be a loss. It would be a symbol of everything I've fought to overcome being taken away from me. But my parents don't see it that way. To them, it's a small thing I could do to keep Emma happy. They keep saying I'm making this a bigger deal than it needs to be. Emma's tantrums have only gotten worse. She slammed her bedroom door so hard yesterday that one of the picture frames in the hallway fell and shattered. My parents' reaction? They told me I should talk to her and try to smooth things over. It's like they're blind to how absurd her behavior is. They see me as the rational one, the bigger person, the one who should know better. It's exhausting. This morning, Emma upped the ante. She posted a long, dramatic rant on social media about how families should support each other and how she's been let down by the people closest to her. She didn't name me directly, but it was obvious who she was talking about. Friends and distant relatives started chiming in, some even messaging me privately to ask what was going on. The embarrassment is unreal. But instead of addressing her behavior, my parents are now more concerned about how this looks to the extended family. They've been pressuring me even harder to fix this and give Emma what she wants. They've even hinted that if I don't, it might be better for everyone if I consider moving out. The sheer audacity of that statement floored me. I've been paying rent, contributing to groceries, and helping around the house, while Emma's biggest contribution is binge-watching TV all day. Yet somehow I'm the problem. I can feel the tension in the house building like a storm. Every time I pass by Emma's room, I can hear her talking loudly on the phone, probably complaining about me. My parents' silence says everything. They've chosen their side, as they always do. But this time, I'm not backing down. This isn't about the car anymore. It's about standing my ground and refusing to be steamrolled by years of favoritism. The house feels like it's about to explode, and I have no idea what's coming next. But one thing is clear, I'm not giving on my car, and I'm not giving in to Emma's theatrics. If that makes me the villain in their story, so be it. I'm done sacrificing my happiness for the sake of someone else's entitlement. It all came to a head when my grandmother, Grace, got involved. She's 79, sharp as ever, and not one to mince words. She doesn't visit often, but when she does, she has a way of noticing things no one else does. That day, she walked in on one of Emma's tantrums. Emma was in full drama mode, yelling about how I was being selfish and tearing the family apart. I tried to stay calm, but the look on Grace's face said it all. She didn't buy a single word of it. After Emma stormed off to her room, Grace cornered me in the kitchen. She asked me what was really going on, and for the first time, I told her everything. I laid it all out. The years of favoritism, the constant emotional manipulation, how Emma's entitlement had been enabled at every turn. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with every word. By the time I finished, she looked furious, but not at me. Grace told me she'd suspected something was off for a while. She said she'd noticed how my parents always seemed to put Emma's needs above mine, but she hadn't realized how bad it was. She called it what it was: unfair, toxic, and something that needed to change. Her validation was like a weight lifting off my chest. For the first time, someone in my family was actually on my side. The next day, Grace showed up with a gift. It was a high-end laptop, the kind I'd never splurge on for myself, but always dreamed of owning. She said it was her way of supporting me in my work. A reminder that someone believed in me. I was stunned. No one in my family had ever done something so thoughtful for me before. But as much as it meant to me, I knew it would only make things worse with Emma. I was right. Emma's reaction was immediate and explosive. She accused me of manipulating Grace into favoring me, calling me an ungrateful brat who always played the victim. She claimed the laptop was proof that I was trying to turn the family against her. It was absurd, but her rage wasn't surprising. What caught me off guard were the threats. Emma said she wouldn't let this go, that she'd make sure I regretted ever crossing her. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Emma's hostility was palpable, and my parents, instead of addressing her behavior, seemed more concerned about keeping the peace. They hinted that Grace's involvement was making things worse, subtly implying that I should have kept quiet. Their indifference stung, but I wasn't about to back down. Grace had my back now, and, for the first time, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in this. Still, the tension was escalating to a dangerous level. Emma's threats weren't just words anymore. She started locking herself in her room for hours, emerging only to glare at me or mutter something under her breath. One night, I heard her talking on the phone, her voice low and menacing. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent chills down my spine. It was clear she was planning something, and whatever it wasn't good. Grace, on the other hand, was a calming presence amidst the chaos. She told me not to let Emma's behavior intimidate me, that I had every right to stand up for myself. Her encouragement meant everything, but it also made me worry about how far Emma was willing to go. The more Grace supported me, the more unhinged Emma seemed to become. One evening, Grace confronted Emma directly. She called out her entitlement and made it clear that her behavior was unacceptable. I wasn't there to witness it, but I heard the aftermath. Emma's screams echoed through the house, followed by the sound of something heavy being thrown. My parents rushed to calm her down, but it was obvious they were walking on eggshells. They'd never seen Emma challenged like this before, and they didn't know how to handle it. By the time things quieted down, I could feel the house shifting. The balance of power was changing, and Emma didn't like it one bit. Grace's presence was a threat to the dynamic she'd always controlled, and she was determined to fight back. I knew I needed to stay vigilant, but part of me couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something bigger. For the first time, Emma's grip on the family was slipping, and I wasn't sure how far she'd go to hold on to it. As I lay in bed that night, my mind raced with possibilities. I didn't know what Emma was planning, but her threats weren't empty. The storm was far from over, and I had a sinking feeling that things were about to get much worse. I came home that evening feeling a little lighter, thanks to my conversation with Grace. Her words stayed with me, a small but powerful reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this mess. The house was quiet when I walked in, almost too quiet. I should have known something was off. Emma's door was ajar, and her room was dark, but the faint sound of movement made my stomach twist. As soon as I stepped into the living room, she appeared, her face twisted with fury. Before I could react, she lunged at me, screaming accusations that I was tearing the family apart. Her nails dug into my arms as she shoved me backward. I stumbled, knocking over a chair, but she didn't stop. Her hands found my laptop, the gift from Grace, and in one swift motion, she hurled it across the room. It hit the wall with a sickening crack, the screen shattering into jagged pieces. When I tried to push past her, she lashed out again, this time aiming directly for my face. I felt the sharp sting of her fist against my nose, followed by a wave of dizziness that left me struggling to steady myself. The pain was blinding, and I fell to the floor, dazed and struggling to breathe. Emma stood over me, her chest heaving, her eyes wild. She spat out something about how I deserved this, how I'd ruined everything for her. Shaking, I managed to crawl away and pull my phone from my pocket. I dialed Grace with trembling fingers, my voice breaking as I told her what had happened. She didn't hesitate. She told me to stay put, that she was on her way, and that she was calling the police. Her calm, firm tone was the only thing keeping me grounded as I pressed a towel to my face, trying to steady myself and calm down. By the time Grace arrived, Emma had retreated to her room, slamming the door so hard the walls seemed to shake. My parents were standing in the hallway, their faces pale but unreadable. When Grace stormed in, she didn't mince words. She demanded to know how they could allow this to happen, how they could stand by while one daughter attacked the other. My parents' response was infuriatingly passive. They murmured something about how Emma had been under a lot of stress lately, how she didn't mean it, how I must have provoked her. Grace wasn't having any of it. She called them out for their complacency, their enabling, their complete failure to protect me. Then she turned to me, her voice softening, and said the words I'd been desperate to hear. "This stops now." The police arrived shortly after. Grace explained everything to them while I sat on the couch, my head spinning from the pain and the overwhelming flood of emotions. Emma came out of her room, her bravado replaced by fear as the officers asked her to step outside. She tried to argue, to paint herself as the victim, but Grace's account and the state of my face told a different story. They handcuffed her and led her out, her protests echoing through the house. I barely registered my parents' reaction. They didn't rush to my side or check if I was okay. Instead, they turned their anger on Grace, accusing her of overstepping, of blowing things out of proportion. My mother even had the audacity to say that this would ruin Emma's life, as if what she'd done to me was somehow irrelevant. My father muttered something about how families should handle things privately, without involving outsiders. Their words felt like knives, cutting deeper than any of Emma's blows. Grace ignored them. She focused on me, helping me gather a few belongings before insisting that I come with her. As we left, my parents stood in the doorway, their expressions a mix of frustration and helplessness. They didn't try to stop us, but their silence spoke volumes. In their eyes, I was the problem. I was the one who had disrupted the fragile illusion of family harmony they'd worked so hard to maintain. At the hospital, the doctors confirmed what I already suspected. My nose was broken. They said it as best they could and gave me painkillers, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional toll. Grace stayed by my side the whole time, her presence a steady anchor in the chaos. She reassured me that I'd done the right thing, that none of this was my fault, but her words couldn't erase the nagging guilt I felt. Meanwhile, Emma's arrest had sent shockwaves through the family. Relatives started calling, some offering support, others parroting my parents' claims that I'd gone too far. The guilt trips came thick and fast, with my mother leading the charge. She accused me of destroying the family, of putting my own sister through unnecessary humiliation. She didn't mention my injuries, didn't acknowledge the fear and pain I'd endured. To her, I was the villain. Lying in that hospital bed, I realized just how deep the dysfunction ran. This wasn't just about the car or the laptop or even Emma's assault. It was about a lifetime of being treated as less than, of being expected to sacrifice and endure for the sake of family. For the first time, I saw it clearly. I couldn't go back. Not to that house, not to those people who'd always chosen Emma over me. Something had to change, and it started with me walking away from it all. Moving in with Grace felt like stepping into a different world. Her small but cozy home became a sanctuary where I could finally breathe without the constant weight of family drama pressing down on me. Grace wasted no time. She hired an attorney, determined to make sure Emma faced real consequences for her actions. The attorney quickly gathered evidence, and it was staggering to see just how much had been overlooked or ignored by my parents. There were records of Emma's past behavior, school reports detailing incidents of aggression, written warnings from teachers, even a few complaints from neighbors about her outbursts. On top of that, Grace had managed to retrieve old family videos where Emma's entitlement and outbursts were on full display. These weren't just isolated moments. They painted a clear picture of a pattern that had gone unchecked for years. The attorney also collected my testimony, along with medical records from the hospital visit, which added undeniable weight to the case. The court proceedings started quickly, and the stark reality of the situation began to set in. Emma's smug demeanor had all but disappeared, replaced by a mix of fear and anger. She showed no remorse, blaming everyone but herself. My parents, as expected, stood by her side, their loyalty unwavering even in the face of overwhelming evidence. They tried to downplay the situation, calling it a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But the court wasn't swayed by their excuses. During the hearings, more truths came to light. The attorney's investigations revealed that my parents had been using the money I contributed to the household, money I thought was going toward rent and groceries, to cover Emma's personal expenses. From shopping sprees to vacations, my hard-earned cash had been funneled into keeping her lifestyle afloat. The betrayal was gut-wrenching, but it also strengthened the case against them. It wasn't just about Emma's actions anymore. It was about the environment that had enabled her. The community's reaction was unexpected. Word of the court case spread quickly, and the facade my parents had maintained for so long began to crack. Neighbors, friends, and extended family started reaching out. Some expressed shock, others offered support, and a few admitted they had always suspected something was wrong. The narrative my parents tried to control was slipping through their fingers, and for once, they could manipulate the story to make themselves look like the victims. The courtroom was tense on the day the verdict was announced. Emma's lawyer made a last-ditch effort to paint her as a victim of stress and family pressure, but it fell flat. The judge's decision was firm. Emma was sentenced to 5 months in prison with mandatory therapy sessions. It wasn't a harsh sentence, but it was enough to send a message that her behavior had real consequences. For the first time, Emma was being held accountable, and it was a relief I hadn't realized I needed. But the fallout didn't stop there. My parents were hit with legal and financial repercussions for their role in enabling Emma. The court ordered them to repay a portion of the money they had taken from me, and they were warned against further attempts to interfere in my life. Their faces as the judge delivered the ruling were a mix of disbelief and indignation. They had spent so long protecting Emma at all costs, and now they were paying the price. Grace's presence throughout all of this was unwavering. She sat beside me in the courtroom, her hand on mine, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. After the verdict, she hugged me tightly and told me how proud she was of me for standing up for myself. It was the kind of support I had craved my entire life, and it gave me a sense of closure I hadn't thought possible. Leaving the courthouse that day felt like stepping into a new chapter. The weight of years of dysfunction and neglect had been lifted, and for the first time, I could see a future that wasn't defined by my family's toxicity. But even as I walked away, I couldn't ignore the lingering sting of my parents' betrayal. They had chosen their favorite daughter over doing what was right, and that was something I would never forget. The days that followed were a mix of relief and reflection. The house I had left behind felt like a distant memory, a place that no longer had any hold over me. Grace and I spent evenings talking, her stories of resilience and strength reminding me that I had the power to rebuild my life. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful. Still, I knew this wasn't the end. Emma's sentence, my parents' reckoning, they were steps forward, but they didn't erase the past. I had a long road ahead, one filled with healing and rediscovery. But with Grace by my side and the truth finally out in the open, I felt ready to take the first steps. Starting fresh with Grace's unwavering support was the first step toward reclaiming my life. She insisted that I start fresh, away from the toxic environment that had defined my life for so long. Within weeks, she helped me find a small apartment in another city. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A blank canvas where I could begin to rebuild. Grace covered the initial expenses, insisting that it was an investment in my future. I never felt so grateful. The move was both liberating and terrifying. For the first time, I was completely on my own. Grace visited often, her presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't truly alone. Slowly, I started to settle into my new life. I found a job at a forward-thinking tech company where my skills were not only recognized but celebrated. My colleagues treated me with a respect I wasn't used to, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged. Tackling therapy was another major step. Grace encouraged me to seek help, and I reluctantly agreed. Talking about everything, the years of neglect, the favoritism, the recent attack, was exhausting, but it was also healing. My therapist helped me see patterns I hadn't noticed before, and over time, I started to let go of the guilt and self-doubt that had been ingrained in me for so long. It was a slow process, but each session brought me closer to understanding my worth. As my confidence grew, so did my social circle. I started attending local meetups and made a few friends who shared my interests. They didn't know the full extent of my past, but they accepted me for who I was. Their kindness was a stark contrast to the conditional love I'd experienced at home. For the first time, I felt like I could be myself without fear of judgment or rejection. Meanwhile, my parents didn't let go as easily. They bombarded me with emails and messages, alternating between guilt trips and veiled threats. My mother's tone shifted from pleading to accusatory, while my father's messages were cold and calculating. They demanded that I come back, claiming that my absence was tearing the family apart. But their words no longer held power over me. I ignored them, blocking their numbers and redirecting their emails to a separate folder I rarely opened. Emma, on the other hand, was silent. Her time in prison and mandatory therapy seemed to have subdued her, at least for now. I didn't hear from her directly, but I occasionally heard through distant relatives that she was struggling to adjust. Part of me felt pity, but I couldn't let myself dwell on it. She was responsible for her actions, and it wasn't my job to fix her. The turning point came a few months after my move. My parents' attempts to manipulate me had grown increasingly desperate, culminating in a particularly cruel message that left me shaken. Grace found me sitting on my couch, clutching my phone with tears streaming down my face. She didn't say much, just sat beside me and held my hand. Later that evening, I made the decision I'd been avoiding for weeks. I wrote a single email to my parents, outlining my boundaries and making it clear that I would no longer be a part of their lives. Then I blocked their addresses and deleted the folder containing their messages. It was painful, but it was also freeing. With that chapter closed, I focused on building the life I'd always wanted. My career flourished, and I started taking on projects that challenged and excited me. I decorated my apartment, filling it with plants, books, and little touches that made it feel like home. Each item I added was a reminder of how far I'd come and how much I had to look forward to. Grace, ever the constant in my life, surprised me one day with news that she was selling her house. She said she wanted to be closer to me, to support me as I continued to grow. Within weeks, she moved into a cozy condo just a few blocks away. Having her nearby was a blessing I hadn't realized I needed. We spent evenings cooking together, sharing stories, and laughing in a way that made me feel like I'd finally found my true family. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when I decided to buy a small house of my own. It was a modest place with a garden and enough space to grow into. Standing in the empty living room, I felt a sense of pride and peace that I'd never experienced before. This was mine, not a gift from someone else, not something I had to fight for, but something I had earned. It symbolized everything I'd overcome and everything I had to look forward to. As I unpacked, I found a photo Grace had slipped into one of the boxes. It was an old picture of her as a young woman, standing in front of her first home with a look of determination and hope. On the back, she'd written a simple message: "Family is who stands by you no matter what." Tears welled up in my eyes as I placed the photo on the mantel. In that moment, I understood what Grace had been trying to teach me all along. Family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about love, respect, and the people who lift you up instead of tearing you down. My past would always be a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I was free to create a future on my own terms, surrounded by the people who truly cared for me. And for the first time in my life, I felt whole.